Chapter 21. There was a voice yelling over and over in Holly's head. It took a while for the meaning to sink in. "Block, Miss Wycliffe. You must block," the voice commanded. Automatically, Holly started blocking. The dizziness passed. The stars that swam in her head vanished. The overwhelming pain ended, and she could again take notice of things around her. They were on the ground beneath the trees. Holly had no idea how they had gotten there. She wasn't even sure where she was or why. "Where am I?" she asked while struggling to move. "Feeling better?" asked Madame Pomfrey, helping Holly to sit up. Yeah." Holly put her hands to her forehead, trying to clear her thoughts. "What happened?" she asked, looking around. "I think you found a survivor," replied Headmistress McGonagall dryly. Holly turned at the voice. The headmistress was kneeling near Holly on one side. She held her broom upwards and leaned on it as a staff. She was watching Holly with concern. "Survivor?" Holly thought, confused. "Survivor!" Everything came back to Holly in a rush. The plane, the search, her fall. "We're too late," she blurted, sobbing. "Someone just died. I felt it. The emotion was there, and then it wasn't. There was nothing." Holly clutched Madame Pomfrey and couldn't stop the crying. "Nonsense," said Madame Pomfrey practically. "Someone probably just passed out, just like Rupert did on the Quidditch match. It's nothing to get upset over," she insisted. "Now, dry your tears and pull yourself together. We need you. Which way are the survivors?" Holly wiped away the tears and stifled her sobs and tried to focus. That way," she pointed finally. Headmistress McGonagall stood and offered her hand to Holly. "Come along then, Miss Wycliffe," she said briskly, helping her up. "We have some survivors to rescue." Madame Pomfrey picked up her medical bag and stood also. Holly brushed away the leaves and dirt from her clothes and grabbed her own broom, which she found leaning against a tree trunk, and led the way through the woods. After they had gone several meters, Holly paused. "Look," she said, pointing. Ahead they could see broken bits of metal, and in the distance the mangled shape of an airplane. "Come on," urged Holly. "We've got to hurry." "No," commanded Headmistress McGonagall, holding Holly back. "We've got to do this right." "How many survivors are there?" she questioned Holly. "Are you close enough to tell?" Holly moved forward a few meters more, stopping near a thick tree trunk. Madame Pomfrey and the headmistress followed. "7," Holly pronounced. "They're pretty bad off," she added urgently. "Calm down," said Madame Pomfrey. "We'll get there soon enough." She knelt beside the trunk and opened her bag. The headmistress opened her bag as well. She drew out 3 dark green bottles, each labeled Marsh Mist. Madame Pomfrey drew out a light blue flask. Holly recognized it as a potion she had tried last year when she had difficulty sleeping at night. It hadn't worked very well. "Let's see," began Madame Pomfrey, calculating. 7 muggles in a weakened condition. 3 drops should do it." "Right," agreed Headmistress McGonagall. She carefully uncorked the first bottle of marsh mist, and Madame Pomfrey dripped 3 drops of sparkling blue potion within. The headmistress quickly recorked the bottle and handed it to Holly. "Shake it well," she instructed. Holly proceeded to shake the bottle vigorously. The process was repeated with the other 2 bottles. Then Madame Pomfrey took out 3 face masks, the kind Holly had seen and used in the hospitals to protect against breathing germs. She handed one to Holly, who looked at it curiously, the other to the headmistress, who tucked it within her robes, and set the third aside for herself. Headmistress McGonagall picked up a leaf and dropped it. The leaf fell silently to the ground. "Good," she observed quietly. "Not much breeze." Then the headmistress lifted 2 of the bottles. "I'll open one there," she said, pointing to an area on the opposite side of the plain. "And the other over there," she added, pointing to another location. "You wait until you see both mists, and then open yours by that tree," she finished, pointing to a stately tree with thick branches and dark green leaves. Madame Pomfrey nodded. "I'll meet you by the tree afterwards," finished Headmistress McGonagall. "What'll I do?" inquired Holly. "You," directed Madame Pomfrey. "Take careful stock of those survivors. See if you can determine their location and condition now. Note who needs what kind of care. They'll be asleep soon, and it'll be much more difficult to diagnose their injuries then." Holly nodded and stared intently at the wreck while Headmistress McGonagall vanished with a loud crack. After a few minutes, a soft white mist with a pale bluish tint seemed to spread across the ground, covering the grass beneath the wreck. A second wave of mist seemed to flow over the ground, coming from a different direction. The mist got thicker, ankle deep, totally obscuring the ground. It rose upwards, thinning the higher it got. Madame Pomfrey led Holly to the tree the headmistress had indicated. "Mask on," she instructed, placing her mask over her mouth and nose. Holly did the same. The mask felt soft and spongy to the touch and seemed to stick onto her face like glue, but she held it in place anyway. Madame Pomfrey opened the third bottle and gently shook out its contents. The mist seemed to flow out of the bottle like liquid, rapidly covering the ground, reaching out, meeting and joining the other mist, and then rising silently upward. They stood quietly watching. The mist got thicker and continued to rise gently until Holly could barely see the outline of the plane. A loud crack sounded. Holly looked, and Headmistress McGonagall, also wearing her mask, had rejoined the two. They continued to watch the mist. The pale bluish tinge faded, and both the headmistress and Madame Pomfrey removed their masks. "You can remove your mask now," said Madame Pomfrey. Holly tried, but the mask stayed stuck to her face. She tugged and tugged without success. "Pull out and up," directed Madame Pomfrey, noticing her difficulties. Holly did so, and the mask came off easily. She handed it back to Madame Pomfrey, who placed it in her medical bag. "Now," said the headmistress briskly, "which way are the survivors? Start with the ones in the worst condition first." Began Holly, facing the rest. "They're not there," she said, panicked. "They were there, and now they're not. They must be dead." "Calm down," said Madame Pomfrey soothingly. "They're asleep," she reminded Holly. "They won't be feeling anything when they're sleeping. Where were they before we released the mist?" Holly closed her eyes, trying to remember. Where had they been? She opened her eyes. "This way," she said, moving towards the wreck. Madame Pomfrey followed, carrying her bag, and Headmistress McGonagall trailed along behind. "Don't look around," commanded the headmistress. But it was hard to not look. Holly had to watch where she was going. It was difficult to see her footing with all the mist. All around her was a terrible stench, a combination of fuel vapors, melted plastics, smoky tree branches, burnt hair, and pot roast. Holly ventured to look down, seeing bits of black and red all around. Then she looked closer and saw a hand. Just a hand. The flesh peeling, the ends crispy black. "Oh, no," thought Holly, her stomach lurching, as she suddenly realized what she was walking through. She stumbled hurriedly to the side and vomited, spitting up all of her breakfast. As she did so, she saw even more bits of flesh, a child's blackened leg with a lacy sock and shoe still attached, a body beyond, just a shape really, horribly burned almost beyond recognition. Holly squeezed her eyes shut and heaved again. There was nothing left in her stomach. The dry heaves continued on and on, renewed with every breath of putrid air she took. Holly felt strong arms encircling her. "There, there," comforted Madame Pomfrey. "It's okay." Holly moaned, rocking softly back and forth in Madame Pomfrey's arms. "Think of the living," Madame Pomfrey urged, "not the dead. You've got to help the living." Madame Pomfrey gently stood Holly up. "The effects of the mist will wear off soon. We must work quickly," she urged. "Help the living. Where do we go?" Holly kept her eyes shut and drew on her memory as she stumbled forward. She let Madame Pomfrey hold her steady and keep her from falling as she moved. But Holly had to look eventually, and by then the mist had cleared more, and she could see the ghastly figures all around in starker detail. "This one," Holly said finally, stopping in front of a burnt figure partially covered by other burnt bodies and pieces of wreckage. "Arms hurt, pressure on the chest, dizziness." Holly recited the symptoms woodenly, trying to block out reality. Looking down, she could easily see the cause of many of the symptoms she described and had felt earlier. The wreckage pressed down on the person, a woman, horrible slashes on her arms with the skin peeled back and white bones showing through. Madame Pomfrey pulled out a bottle and a large spoon. "Help me," she commanded, handing the bottle and spoon to Holly. "Pour me a spoonful," Madame Pomfrey told Holly, while she knelt and cradled the woman's head in her arms. Holly uncorked the bottle, knelt and spooned some unidentified potion between the woman's lips. That should stabilize things for a while, Madame Pomfrey said, while lowering the woman's head gently back down. Then she stood. Who's next? She asked. Think of the living, think of the living, Holly repeated over and over to herself as she made her way to the next survivor, trying hard to not see the surrounding carnage, but failing miserably. The next living passenger was still in the body of the plane, still strapped in. There were two, actually, seated side by side amid the other dead. A third was seated further ahead. There were rows of chairs filled with dead bodies strapped down in between. Head hurt, chest hurts, difficulty breathing. Holly recited the symptoms, and Madame Pomfrey told her which bottles to open and how much potion to give to the survivors. While Madame Pomfrey held their heads, Holly spooned various potions between their lips. They don't look too bad off and should recover quickly once they remove this wreckage, commented Madame Pomfrey, surveying the situation. Where else? As in a dream, Holly unerringly led Madame Pomfrey to another piece of wreckage apart from the main plane, with a female survivor strapped within, and then to a man, horribly burned, lying near a wing. She hoped it was just soft, muddy ground she was stepping on along the way, not something else, something once part of someone. Lastly, Holly came to a stop in front of a child, buried beneath more wreckage. "I think this one's alive over here," came the voice of Headmistress McGonagall. "What?" thought Holly, surprise overcoming her horrid stupor as the headmaster's words sank in. There had been nobody over there, and certainly not up high as the headmistress's voice indicated. "There can't be," she said uncertainly. "I would have known." "Not if the person was unconscious before we set off the mist," replied Madame Pomfrey, hurrying to assist the headmistress. Holly followed along more slowly, coming to a stop beneath a huge tree with a thick trunk. "Perhaps this is the one that caused you to pass out," added Madame Pomfrey. Holly doubted it. She was positive the passenger she had felt while on the broom had died. But she appreciated Madame Pomfrey trying to make her feel better. The passenger was still strapped to a chair, but the chair was hanging upside down between the branches in the tree. Using her broom, the headmistress flew to the tree and released the chair. Madame Pomfrey used her wand to stop the falling chair mid-air and lower it gently to the ground, tipping the chair sideways when it landed. "That'll make it easier to rescue this one," commented the headmistress, flying down and dismounting from her broom, while Madame Pomfrey spooned some potion into the person's mouth. Headmistress McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey combed the wreckage thoroughly, looking for more survivors, unconscious survivors, that Holly might have missed earlier. Holly sat on the side, staring blankly into space, hugging her body tightly, trying to forget what she had already seen. She felt overwhelmed by all the death and bodies. She felt guilty that she had missed someone, and guilty for not joining them in their search. But Holly just couldn't. She couldn't make herself walk out amongst the fumes and burnt bodies again. Fortunately, no one asked her to. So Holly waited wordlessly on the edge, with tears streaming down her face, until the headmistress and Madame Pomfrey finished. The two found 3 more survivors amid the wreckage, 3 more people Madame Pomfrey's potions were able to help. Then Headmistress McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey returned to stand next to Holly. "I think we've done what we can here," commented the headmistress while she scribbled a message on a scrap of paper. Then she affixed the note to the leg of the tiny owl that sat on her shoulder. She whispered some directions in the owl's ear, and it took off flying through the air. "Drink this," encouraged Madame Pomfrey, kneeling down next to Holly. "It'll make you feel better." Holly gulped down the contents of the spoon Madame Pomfrey placed to her lips. The sharp taste caused her to choke and cough, but it cleared some of the fog from Holly's mind, and suddenly she could no longer smell the horrible stench nearby. She couldn't smell anything. "I should have given you some earlier," Madame Pomfrey apologized, "but I didn't realize it was going to be like this. None of us did." Holly clung to her and began crying freely. Then Holly heard a sharp fizzing sound like that of a rocket shooting off. She looked at the source and saw that the headmistress had used her wand to send a stream of white clouds into the air. A few minutes later a loud crack sounded, and the familiar figure of Mr. Tuttle appeared. He was wearing the clothes of a hiker with boots and a hat. He looked around upon his arrival and immediately walked over to Headmistress McGonagall. Mr. Tuttle frowned as he surveyed the wreckage. "This is bad," he commented in a low voice. "Real bad. Any survivors?" We found 11, which we stabilized, replied Madame Pomfrey, leaving Holly and joining them. But you might want to double-check. Mr. Tuttle took a step forward towards the wreckage and then stopped. He said, wrinkling his nose. I'll take your word. The Muggles will be here soon enough to double-check. Were you seen? No, answered the headmistress. We used marsh mist and a sleeping potion. Good, said Mr. Tuttle. How soon will they start waking? 3, maybe 5 minutes at the most, answered Madame Pomfrey. I didn't dare give them much, given their already weakened state. Then we'll have to work fast. This wreck is too large to move off the Hogwarts grounds, but it is close to the edge of the school boundaries. We'll set back the anti-Muggle wards to permit Muggle entry. I'll ensure that a Muggle makes the find. Then, when they've finished, we'll replace the wards at their original position. How does that sound? The headmistress nodded her agreement. Mr. Tuttle looked overhead. This site should have been visible from the air. Why isn't there any tree damage? He asked abruptly. Professor Hagrid used to walk Cuddles, his pet spitting monitor lizard, out this way, replied Headmistress McGonagall dryly. I asked Professor Longbottom to give the area a boost with Forever Grow fertilizer to help the trees recover from the damage. They're still on a growth spurt. A spitting monitor lizard, said Mr. Tuttle, hiding a smile. I've heard they can be destructive. But no matter. We can use that to our advantage. The tree cover explains why it took so long for the Muggles to find the crash site. His glance fell on Holly, sitting alone, staring out into space, hugging her knees, rocking gently back and forth. How is she? He inquired softly, as Holly tucked her head into her lap while continuing to rock. Madame Pomfrey shook her head. I don't know, she replied with concern. She found the crash site and has helped as much as she could, but this hit her pretty hard. It's really nasty out there. Mr. Tuttle walked over to where Holly was sitting, knelt down and placed his hand gently on her back. Hey there, he began softly. I hear you're still rescuing Muggles. Good job. Holly looked up at him with her tear-stained face. No, it wasn't, she argued. It was a lousy job. What? Mr. Tuttle looked at her with surprise. I can't even tell when someone needs help, Holly exploded with emotion. I can't selectively block. I can't ride a broom properly. I can't even count. Holly stopped to take a breath. There were 11 of them, she continued, practically shouting. 11! And I couldn't find them all. I'm even a lousy empath. Confused, Mr. Tuttle looked over at Madame Pomfrey and Headmistress McGonagall. They were unconscious, replied Madame Pomfrey by way of explanation. Oh, he replied softly. He looked down at Holly again. Miss Wycliffe, he began gently. Holly, I think you sell yourself too short. We wouldn't have found the crash, wouldn't have found the survivors, all 11 of them, if you hadn't led us here. That is not something to be ashamed of. Holly looked up at the wizard, looked about to speak, when suddenly she turned her head towards the survivor in the tipped chair. They're waking, she said. Mr. Tuttle immediately drew Holly up and quietly guided her to a safer location behind a tree. Madame Pomfrey and the headmistress silently joined them. Madame Pomfrey, whispered Headmistress McGonagall, I think your work here is finished. Why don't you escort Miss Wycliffe back to Hogwarts? We'll remain to take care of things. Unless you wish to stay, put in Mr. Tuttle. Do you need to stay this time? He asked Holly, remembering how she had insisted on staying with Meg until the very end. No, sir, replied Holly in a shaky voice. Their emotions when they see the wreck. I don't think I could bear... Holly turned 2 shades paler as she vividly relived her own feelings out in the wreckage earlier. They'll know we were here, she said, suddenly panicked. I got sick. That's already been taken care of, said the headmistress smoothly. You've nothing to worry about. Go on with Madame Pomfrey. So Holly followed Madame Pomfrey into the woods and away from the wreck. It was dark before Madame Pomfrey and Holly made it back to Hogwarts. Holly had refused to use her broom. Neither of them had felt much like lunch, so there had been no urgency in trying to return sooner. By that time, the Muggles had already found the crash site and airlifted the survivors to the nearest hospital facility. Madame Pomfrey later told Holly that the initial Muggle reports indicated all the survivors might make a full recovery. Holly skipped dinner as well. In fact, she wasn't sure she could ever again smell, let alone eat cooked meat without getting sick to her stomach. Holly told the rest of the Hufflepuffs about the crash at a special house meeting after dinner that night. The Hufflepuffs all cheered at her success. Holly left out the gorier details of the rescue. She just couldn't bear to think about it, let alone share that information with the others. Holly told Becky more of what happened later on in private and cried herself into an exhausted sleep that night, with Becky holding her tight. The Daily Prophet later featured a huge spread on Mr. Tuttle and how he kept Hogwarts safe from the wandering muggles. The article went on to report how alert Hogwarts staff had located the crash, making the rescue of survivors possible. No mention was made of Holly's part in the rescue, which suited Holly just fine. Unfortunately, alert students who had noticed Holly take off with Headmistress McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey, or had seen her weary return with Madame Pomfrey that evening, guessed otherwise. Soon Holly's part in the rescue became common knowledge around the school. The Slytherins again teased Holly unmercifully about her failure to get her name mentioned in the news, and Holly did her best to ignore them. It was harder to deal with the congratulations and greetings of well-wishing students genuinely pleased at Holly's part in finding the wreck, or politely dodged their well-meaning requests for her account of what happened. Holly had barely been able to tell the Hufflepuffs what had happened, and couldn't bear to describe her experiences to others. They all thought she was a hero. They didn't understand how she had failed, had missed 4 she might have found. Holly devoted most of her time trying to forget the images and smells she had seen that day, but failed dismally. Within a few days, the Muggles had recovered all the bodies. By the end of the next week, they had cleaned up the wreck site and removed all the plain pieces. Headmistress McGonagall announced that the students could again go to Hogsmeade, and student life again returned to normal.